As you're watching this video, make sure you have the two handouts so you can take notes and better understand the book. The reason I do this at the beginning of the unit is just to give you background information on the novel, because it focuses on the Battle of Gettysburg, which was halfway through the Civil War. So we're starting the book now, even though we haven't even really started the Civil War, because otherwise we're never going to get through it. So I always spend some time giving background information so you can better understand it. So the book was written in 1974 by a man named Michael Shara. He wrote the book. His great-grandfather was at the battle, fought in the battle, so he was intrigued by the subject, and he ends up writing this novel. Won a Pulitzer Prize in 1975, so it was well received. This book caused many historians to re-examine their views on Gettysburg. What I mean by this, Gettysburg happens in 1863, and it ended up being maybe the most important battle of the Civil War. So I'm sure in the years that followed, dozens and dozens of books by different historians were written about Gettysburg, where they analyzed everything and they came up with the story of Gettysburg. Well, when Shara wrote this, he looked at it kind of in a different perspective, and historians read this and said, you know what, maybe Gettysburg didn't quite happen like we have been writing for the last 100 years, and there might be some different perspectives to it. So it was influential. And it does focus on the Battle of Gettysburg, which was in July of 1863. As you read the book, you'll notice this right away. It kind of switches back and forth from chapter to chapter, and it focuses on different people that were some of the main characters at Gettysburg. You will notice as time goes on, there are more chapters about Southern commanders and the Southern perspective, although it certainly does cover the North. So the background information you need to get you up to speed is when Gettysburg was fought, the Civil War had been going on for just over 2 years, and the South had been winning more often in the early part of the war. The South was, you could almost say they were dominating the first 2 years of the war. Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania, which is a northern state. This is one of the few times when the South actually attacked the North, and it will be the last time that they do so. So most, we'll talk about this in class, probably 99% of all Civil War battles were fought in the South. So this was unique in that it was a northern battle, which meant the South went up there to attack. More soldiers will die at Gettysburg than any other Civil War battle. That's one of the reasons it's more well known. And most historians regard Gettysburg as the turning point of the war. What I mean by that, first 2 years South is dominating, then Gettysburg happens. And then after that, the war will go on for another 2 years, but it's starting to go downhill pretty quickly for the South. So make sure you're on the right side for this. This is what is called the Union Command structure. So the military is set up with a hierarchy, and at the top was General George G. Meade. He is in charge of the entire Army of the Potomac, which was the Northern Army. The only person he answers to is President Lincoln. And then underneath him, he has commanders. And you see their names out there. And then underneath, there are more people. And it keeps going until the very bottom, till you're talking about your basic soldiers. Anyway, all of these guys will be mentioned in the book. However, see the ones I've circled. Go ahead and circle those on your sheet. Those are the ones that when they come up in the book, you need to pay particular attention to, because they're some of our main characters. Also, you'll notice Buford over here, he has a star next to his name, and the star down below says cavalry. Cavalry were soldiers that fought from horseback, and there weren't nearly as many of them, and they were considered, if you were in cavalry, you were it was a better role. It was more prestigious, and I want to say probably better soldiers. Remember, this is 1863, so there's two types of soldiers. There's cavalry, those that fight from horses, and then there's foot soldiers, and the vast majority are foot soldiers. Okay, don't let this confuse you, but now we're moving to the South side, or the Confederate side, and they were named the Army of Northern Virginia. I would try to ignore the North part because this is the Southern Army, okay? But it was called the Army of Northern Virginia. Same thing we see up at the top is Robert E. Lee. The only person he answers to is the president of the Confederacy, who was Jefferson Davis. These are his main commanders, and then it goes down from there. circle the ones I have circled. Also, take note that Jeb Stuart, one of the main characters of the book, is the cavalry commander. And now I'm going to introduce you to the Confederate High Command. These are the highest ranking officers in the Confederate Army. And I'm going to spend more time with them than the northern ones because they are featured more in the book. So you'll see here, and I think this has proved to be kind of useful in the past. I have nicknamed all these guys with different words. And we're calling this guy the brain of the Army. And you'll see why in just a second, why he's the brain. Anyway, that is Robert E. Lee. Some background, originally from Virginia. He was originally with the Union Army. I'll come back to that. He did not think the southern states should leave and form their own country in 1861. So a lot of these guys that we're going to talk about, they had been in the Army for a long period in their lives. But you have to remember, there weren't always two armies. Okay, in the war, there was the Southern Army and there was the Northern Army. Before the South seceded, there was one army, the United States Army. And a lot of these guys that made their way to the top knew one another. But once the South secedes, some of them will go to the Southern Army and some of them will go to the Northern Army. So it makes it an interesting aspect of a civil war. They know one another. So they'll talk about it in the book. Lee's going to talk about Meade, who is the Northern general, and they, prior to this, had been friends. So, as mentioned, this is what makes it a civil war. Lincoln asked him to be the commander of the Union Army, but he turned it down to fight with the South. So that tells you how widely or how highly regarded he was. Lincoln went to Robert E. Lee and said, "You are my first choice to lead this army against the South," but being a Virginian, he wouldn't do that. Robert E. Lee is the overall commander of the Confederate Army. He makes all primary decisions. He gives all orders. He's the brain. He's the one that comes up with strategy and tactics and things like that. You'll see this in the book. He's going to ask his other generals underneath him for their advice, and they'll give him advice, and there'll be discussions on what they should do. But when it comes down to it, it's Lee's call. Next person, this is Jeb Stuart. We're calling him the eyes of the Army. Background on him, from Virginia, also originally with the Union Army. He actually, in 1856, was in Kansas when Bleeding Kansas was going on. Participated in the capture of John Brown at Harper's Ferry, as did Robert E. Lee. Jeb Stuart is the cavalry commander. Again, cavalry is horses. His job was to scout the enemy's location. What I mean by this, before the battles take place, Robert E. Lee would call up Jeb Stuart, and he's like, "Jeb, I need you to go out and spy on my enemy. Not fight them, but spy. Scout is the technical word. I want to know how many soldiers they have. I want to know how many horses, how many cannons, which direction they're traveling, so on and so forth." He's almost like an information gatherer. Okay, he's the eyes. Then Jeb Stuart takes that information, takes it back to Lee, who's the brain, so Lee can make battle decisions. Jeb Stuart has also been very successful at raiding behind enemy lines, but this job is secondary to scouting. Raiding is when, and Jeb Stuart loved to do this. This is going to be a theme of the book. Jeb Stuart loved to ride his horses with his men up in the north, and they would go into these northern towns and steal stuff. Okay, called it joyriding. So he's good at it. He's good at everything he does, but his main job is scouting. This is secondary. Jeb Stuart also thinks very highly of himself and is somewhat of a renegade. A little bit of an ego on Jeb Stuart. The sword of the army. Stonewall Jackson, originally from Virginia. Do you sense a pattern here? Stonewall Jackson was Lee's expert at attack. He was aggressive and fearless. Anytime Robert E. Lee wanted to go attack the North in a battle, whatever, he would call up Stonewall Jackson. He'd say, "Stonewall, get up here. We are attacking. You're my expert. You're aggressive. I'm going to let you kind of take over." That's why we were calling him the sword. A sword is a weapon that you attack with. One thing you might have noticed, I used past tense there. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was in May of 1863, Stonewall Jackson was accidentally killed by his own men. Lee had to restructure the Army of Northern Virginia to replace him. So what this means is he's dead at Gettysburg, Stonewall Jackson is. So Lee has decided to invade the North to force them to surrender, but he's invading or attacking them without his expert at attack, the sword. So Jackson, as mentioned, is not alive, but he will be mentioned a lot in the book. Which leads us to this man, the shield of the army, James Longstreet. Not from Virginia. He was actually from South Carolina and Georgia. He's the expert at defense, hence the shield. He is very much aware of the destruction that can be done with new developments in weapons and will almost always argue for fighting from a fortified or a defensive position. Some of you are going to get sick of this because every time Lee asks for advice, or Stonewall, Longstreet's like, we got to defend, we got to defend, we got to defend. He's like a broken record over and over and over again, but that's what he's good at. Whoops. I can't go back. That's all there was for it. So before Gettysburg, this is what it looks like. He has his sword, he has his shield, and he has his eyes. So prior to Gettysburg, these four have led an army that is under-equipped. They never have enough guns, ammo, food, underfed, outnumbered. Going into most of these battles, the North has tens of thousands of more troops. So it's like they have every disadvantage. However, prior to Gettysburg, they had only left their enemy in control of the battlefield once. What that means, it doesn't mean they won every battle except one. What it means is that in the battles, they either won the battle, or in the battles they were losing, they recognized early in the battle, hey, we're not going to win this. We're in some trouble, and they would bail. They would bolt out of there. They would leave on their own terms before their army got destroyed. So literally, those four men are running circles around the Northern Army. Here were the Union commanders defeated by Lee with Longstreet, Jackson, and Stuart. All of these guys were defeated. And we'll talk about this in class. Abraham Lincoln was so frustrated with these guys because they kept losing that he kept firing them. Okay, three key themes of the book. These are things that you're going to want to be on the lookout for as we read it. Culture clash. And this is simply the differences between the North and the South. The book does a good job explaining how the North and the South, how Northerners and Southerners were different from one another. So that is a theme. Number 2, heroes and non-heroes. Obviously, we know what a hero is. A hero is someone that is kind of the star, or someone we look up to. And then non-heroes, I wouldn't say, sometimes we think of heroes and villains. I think villains is too strong of a word for this, but the non-heroes might be people that didn't do their best work at Gettysburg when it came to soldiering, if you will. Joshua Chamberlain is going to fit into one of these categories very, very well. And then finally, with the book, The Defense of James Longstreet. Prior to this book, Longstreet had a really awful reputation, and a lot of historians blamed him for losing at Gettysburg. Sharo's going to write from a different perspective concerning Longstreet that maybe, and I'm not saying I wasn't at Gettysburg, I don't know enough about Gettysburg, maybe he wasn't to blame. Maybe there were others to blame. So again, a different perspective with that. As far as the readings go, grades, all of that good stuff, we will have assignments twice a week with questions on average, and I can't do it exactly 30 every time because I don't dictate how many pages are in a chapter, but on average, you'll be about 30 pages per reading, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less, but 30 pages twice a week. There are questions, comprehension questions that go along with that. They're due every Monday and Thursday, the reading and the questions, unless I tell you otherwise. But I think it's just easier if we get into that habit of, okay, our reading and questions are due Monday and Thursday morning. About halfway point in the book, 3 weeks or so, we have a quiz over the main people and events. At the end of the book, We will have a quiz over the entire book, the main people, the events, and there will be an essay question. Okay, I don't know why it says first and second quarter. Ignore that. It should say third quarter. Killer Angels will have a significant impact on your third quarter grade. If you keep up with the reading and the questions and participate in the class discussions and do your best work, you'll do fine. It's going to be a struggle for some of you. Some of you at the end of the year will look back and say, you know what, that might have been the hardest thing we did. But you have to stick with it. If you end up quitting on the book, if you stop about halfway through, it doesn't end well. And it happens every year. There's always a handful of people that make it to about a halfway point and say, you know what, this isn't for me. I'm done. Okay, your grade is going to suffer from that. That's the natural consequence. So even if you do struggle with it, stick with it, do the reading, do the questions. We will always discuss the reading in class. So if you come in Monday morning and you don't understand some of the things with the previous chapter, we're going to discuss that. You can ask questions. So that's where I'm going to come in and help you with some of the more difficult parts. But you have to keep with it.